Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Dravidian Does History, the audio version. In previous week's episode, I outlined my plan for this series and why the idea for starting a discussion about Indian history and the idea for writing my book, The Lords of India, The Evolution of Imperial Identity from Ajatashatru to Alamgir, Volume 1, came to me when I went to India on my holidays and came back and had conversations with Indians and international people while I was living in Canada. This episode, I wanted to get into more of the nitty-gritty about the idea of Indian history, why it's so difficult to talk about Indian history, what is my perspective on it, and why I wanted to talk about it, and why it's so difficult to have conversations about Indian history, and all of that. And I also wanted to get into the first stage of Indian history, which is the prehistory part of it. To begin, I just wanted to express why I'm doing this talk on Indian history and why I wrote the book on Indian history. It's because Indian history is so vast and so varied. I wanted to find my own little perspective to talk about it. And in the book, The Lords of India, Volume 1, which is already out, I talk about Indian history specifically from the point of view of the evolution of its different imperial states. What I mean by that is that most countries in the world discuss their history from an imperial perspective. For example, if we look at English history, it starts off from its earliest stage when the Angles and Jutes and the Britons first established tribal societies, and then it evolved into kingdoms. And then they had the Kingdom of Mercia and Anglia and all of these places. And then the Normans came and conquered everything. And after the Norman conquest, um, they had the English monarchy properly established and continued as a straight line throughout history, with obvious detours here and there, but then eventually has reached today where King Charles the third is ruling, but the whole dynasty and the whole history can be outlined and explained rather easily. And if you look at ancient Egypt, again, its history, particularly in its earliest stage, which is the history of Kemet as a society and as a state, existing from roughly around 3500 BCE to 30 BCE, that history, again, is outlined based on the history of the various dynasties that ruled this one kingdom. Unfortunately, that kind of history is not possible for India because while India is a huge land, um, different dynasties have occupied it through different periods of time. Different areas have been conquered by different states. So, a unified linear history of India is entirely impossible. It's like trying to tell a linear history of the whole of Africa or trying to tell the entire linear history of all of Europe in one go. It just doesn't make any sense unless we tie it up with the narrative which makes sense. And the narrative I have chosen to tell is the history of the largest states in India by looking at the evolutions and changes that take place in Indian society, in Indian kingship, in Indian religion, in Indian languages, etc., by looking at it through the lens of the evolution of monarchy. Because again, before 1947, most of India was ruled by monarchs or kings or emperors or queens and different versions of these titles for roughly about 3,000 years. And while its manifestations differed in different areas, in different periods, and in different cultures, and even in the different linguistic contexts, the idea of kings being the ones to express power and to shape societies has existed in India for the longest period of time. And it's a good way to look at the various societies within India. Now, a note on why I call this history and the historical period and the historical location of my discussions India. By India, I do not mean the modern Republic of India, which came to existence after 1947, and when the Republic of India was officially announced with the publication of the Constitution. And that's when the modern Republic of India forms, with its current political boundaries, with its different states, and with its different political situations. That's a entirely different entity from what I'm discussing. I'm discussing historical India. Now, what does that mean? Historical India, in this context, is the land that has been historically identified with the people of India. And I'll come into more detail about it as I discuss the different names of the land that is currently called India. But in my idea, India, as I discuss it, encompasses most of South Asia, from eastern Afghanistan through Pakistan, the Republic of India, Bangladesh, from Kashmir in the north and down south to the northern parts of Sri Lanka. That's what I mean when I say India. It's a historical region that is bounded by these boundaries where the culture, the religions, the societies, the languages that are uniquely Indian evolved, and the cultural ideas and cultural markers that are uniquely Indian, which have now spread into the independent nations of Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and northern Sri Lanka, and all of these places have been shaped by the ideas that originated in historical India. Now, the region that is considered historical India is not to be equated with the political ideology of Akhand Bharat, for example, which is a purely political idea expressed by certain political parties, and that's not what I'm talking about. It is also not an expression of the Indosphere, which is another slightly political but mostly sociological as well as general cultural idea, which expresses an area where Indian ideas and Indian political spectrums and religious ideas and cultural markers have exerted great influence. And it spreads roughly from, again, from around Afghanistan, but stretches all the way towards Southeast Asia, because, again, the different cultures that have evolved in these areas have been significantly influenced by Indian literary, cultural, political, and religious ideas. But that's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about India in a historical context. I'm specifically talking about the geographical piece of land that is today considered South Asia, but specifically refers to the area roughly from around eastern Afghanistan all the way to Bangladesh, from roughly Kashmir in the north to northern Sri Lanka in the south. That landmass is what I'm referring to when I talk about historical India, because that is the region that has most directly been impacted by the different cultures and kingdoms and states and powers and monarchs that have existed in India. So that is the region that we will be discussing in the episodes that will be available soon. This is also the topic that I'm discussing in detail in my book as well. The land that is today called India and historically called India, again, the name has been different for it in different periods of time. The name India, of course, comes from the Greek version of the word for the land beyond the Indus River. That's how the name India came to be, and it's a historical name. It is not a modern invention, as some political parties might like to say. It is a historical reference to the people and the lands beyond the Indus River from a Greco-Roman perspective. Similarly, the name Hindustan is again exactly the same name India, but expressed from a Islamo-Persian ideology because they couldn't say sir, so they used the sound her. And that's how the people beyond the Sindhu became Hindu, and the land that existed beyond the river Sindhu became Hindustan, basically referring to the land of the Hindus or the land of the people of the Sindhu, which is the same idea as India. Other names have been used throughout the historical record for the land that is bounded by the Himalayas and the oceans, depending on which sources that you go to. Aryavarta was the name that was used by the Vedic people for the lands that they existed in and for the land that they tamed and conquered and made their home. Bharata became another name that was used for the lands that was occupied by the people who were descendants of that tribal hegemony. Jambudvipa has been used in a lot of Indic historical texts to define the landmass that is today India. So again, lots of historical names for the place. And if you go to different cultures that existed in different periods of time, they refer to India with different names or different variations of the same name that I have mentioned so far. So again, nomenclature isn't all that important, but just remember that when I talk about India, I'm not referring to the modern Republic of India, which is only a tiny blip in the history of historical India. It's only existed for under 80 years, which is less than the lifetime of most rulers in most ancient dynasties. Now, how do we talk about Indian history? Where do we find the information when we are trying to discuss Indian history? When we look at the different sources, there are different ways to look at the history of any region. For example, once again, I'll use the example of ancient Egypt to differentiate it from the history of India. Ancient Egypt had a robust historical and documentary setup from its earliest phase. From its earliest historical phase, from roughly around 3100 BCE, we get names of historical people and places and locations and ideas. And the writing system, that is the hieroglyphs, generally called the hieroglyphic writing system, was already mature and developed in a period like about 3100 to 2500 BCE. And it was extremely useful in documenting every step of the evolution of that kingdom from the earliest stage when Lower and Upper Egypt was unified under one king, and then that kingdom continued on until 30 BCE when it ended, when the Romans took over the region. There was ample historical evidence, ample written documentation, ample archaeological evidence, and other sources were available. The same cannot be said, unfortunately, about Indian history. Written records don't appear in India until way past the middle of the first millennium BCE. So, roughly around 400 to 300 BCE is when we first get the earliest actual written records about historical Indian persons that are recognizably Indian and that are not legendary or mythological. So we can't depend again, once again, on written records from for the earliest stage of Indian history. Archaeological sources are again a great source for any historical period. And by archaeological records, I mean buildings, pottery, objects, statues, etc., that are tangible, that you can touch, that you can observe, that you can feel, that you can take apart and understand how a society works. If you look at ancient Egypt, once again, you have the Great Pyramids from the Old Kingdom, from roughly around 2600 to 2200 BCE. Lots and lots of pyramids. We have nothing of the sort equivalent to it in the Indian subcontinent. The closest that we get to that is the remains of the Indus Valley Civilization, but it's not equivalent. Why? I'll tell you later when I discuss the Indus Valley Civilization. We get pottery shards and materials like that from the later periods when the earliest Indic societies start to exist. But again, nothing in comparison to what existed in ancient Egypt. But archaeological information from the later periods, from roughly around 400 BCE onwards, we get slightly more data from the archaeological material. Digs are going on every day. There are more and more information coming to light, and we're getting more and more information. And in the next 100 years, the entire history of India might be changed based on the material that is found. But for now, based on the archaeological evidence that we have, a general picture of Indian history has already been established. Another source of great information is numismatic, which is coins and mints. Coins, um, as a system of exchange, precedes physical cash. And before coins, there was a barter system. So, again, understanding the evolution of the use of coins helps us understand when a society evolved from prehistorical to mostly historical, and when trade started to flourish, and how societies established themselves, and how trading systems evolved, and how the control of resources was expressed. So, and again, coins give us a great understanding on how the emperors or the rulers or the dynasts thought about themselves and thought about their societies and how they wanted to express themselves to the audience, being the general public, as well as other monarchs and other states that they were contemporaneous with. So, again, numismatic sources are great sources for historical information, direct as well as indirect. How? We'll learn about them later in more detail as we discuss each different period of Indian history. Writings from travelers and diplomats from other regions of the world provide also great contextual information about Indian history. We have Megasthenes during the early historical period. We have writers like Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta in the late medieval periods. And up into the modern age, as different people come into historical India and come in contact with the different societies and different kingdoms and different monarchs, they express themselves in their writings and tell us a lot about not just what existed in India, but also what existed in the rest of the world and their ideas and their prejudices and their expectations regarding India, which is again a great tool to understand what the world thought about India, not just about what Indians thought about India. It is always a great gauge about the status of the different kingdoms and states that existed in India at any given point of time. Then we also have court documents, histories, and hagiographies written within India in the course of the different kings and empires that existed at any given point of time. The thing about Indian historical documentation in this form, particularly from court documents, is that a lot of them are, of course, biased against the different other kingdoms that they existed in the same period of time and tend to exaggerate the achievements of the kings and dynasties that they're talking about. That's not unusual. That's true for every dynasty, that's true for every kingdom around the world. When the Egyptians are talking about the great conquests of their pharaohs in Nubia or in the Kushite areas or in Palestine or even towards the northern Mediterranean to where Turkey is now, we have to gauge them with our understanding of archaeological and numismatic evidence to counterbalance the exaggerated narratives. We can do the same thing about Indian narratives about the different kingdoms and the achievements of the kings, and having the ability to weigh archaeological and numismatic and external evidence against whatever court documents and hagiographies are telling us is a great way to put perspective on what they are talking about and to understand in greater detail on what is going on. But that is not to say that these documents are always unreliable. They give us a great insight on the psyche of the people who are creating them. It tells us a great deal about what these people are trying to achieve by writing these documents. When, for example, a king is talking about conquering the land all the way across the Ganges and then conquering the lands up to the oceans, he's trying to express himself in such a way that he establishes that he is the greatest king in this land, that he has conquered every piece of land that has been expressed in the mythological and religious texts and is conquering the idea of India. And he wants his people to know that he is the conqueror of all the lands that are traditionally considered Indian. And by again understanding what he means by traditional India, we also get an idea of what was not considered part of traditional India during different periods of time. So, again, court writings like that are a great source of information throughout the ages about Indian history. The availability of documents might vary, the availability of sustainable information might vary. We might get only snippets for certain rule. We only might get pieces of information about certain kings and certain kingdoms. But whatever we do get can be great assets in fleshing out the history of the different periods of India. Further information can be gathered from the poetry and literature that is created during any period of time. India, as a society, has always been affluent with great poetry, great storytelling, and expressing the ideas and emotions of people through words. It might have been oral at the earliest of stages. Even the Vedic corpus is started out as oral tradition and then only got written down much later. But again, it contains a storehouse of knowledge and information about societies, maybe even unintentionally, that give us a great idea of what people thought about, what their concerns were, how they viewed the world, how they thought about other people, and what they thought the responsibilities of the people were towards each other. It gives us a great deal of understanding. And as we move towards the historical period and we start getting legitimate classical Sanskrit and other languages evolving through the first millennium CE, we get more and more information about the people and how they adapted to their surroundings and how kings expressed their kingship and how these kings adapted to the religious changes that were going on in India and how people, common people, even express their own desires and their own expectations from these kings. All of this is wonderfully expressed in the different stories that people tell each other. And especially in court poetry and the kind of poetry that has been favored by different dynasties and religious movements, gives us an idea of the different periods of Indian history and helps us pinpoint in what sort of area and what sort of period certain evolutions took place and took root and spread across the rest of what is today India and Pakistan and Bangladesh. And extending onto it, we have to give attention to folk tales, legends, myths, etc. Because again, they give us an understanding of what the average person in the streets thought about the world. What were his concerns? Was he concerned about death or life? What did he think about life after death? What did he think about the king that he might not have seen very often, but his power was expressed through the very monuments and rituals and public displays that were showcased all over the place? What did the ordinary person think about that? Was he concerned that he was being governed by somebody in a palace, gathering all the wealth to himself? Was he concerned about what would happen to his body once he died? Again, all of this is greatly expressed through the many schools of poetry and prose and drama, etc., that evolved over India. And again, India has a rich, rich history of not only Sanskrit and imperial poetry and storytelling, regional and storytelling has been a great asset for modern historians to try and understand the picture of the societies of India, away from just imperial palaces and into the hearts of the average person in villages and in towns and traveling across the world. So these are the primary sources that we'll be using to discuss Indian history. The archaeological, the numismatic, the written records of travelers and diplomats, the court documents, histories, and hagiographies, be it Sanskrit, regional languages, or even Persian, poetic and literary traditions, folk tales, myths, legends, all of it. Every resource that is available to us will be used in trying to understand and discuss the history of India so that we can get a greater picture of what India was in the past and how it shaped what India is today and how it may affect what India is going to be tomorrow and what different shades of political power and religious authority and linguistic expressions helped shape the world that is today in India and how it may affect it in the future and what we can learn from all of the trends that have happened and how we can effect change moving forward. So now we'll get into actual discussion of history, now that we have gotten the discussions about sources and nomenclature out of the way. Where do we start the discussion of Indian history? Remember, I mentioned that my interests through these discussions for all the episodes would be on the imperial edifice, on telling the story of India through the largest states that existed in India at any given point of time. So where do we start? We always have to start with the Indus Valley Civilization. It is the oldest documented, dated civilizational society that existed in the Indian subcontinent. It was also one of the largest ancient civilizations that existed in the world. It is considered, along with ancient China, ancient Egypt, and ancient Mesopotamia, to be one of the birthplaces of civilization in human societies. It is where urban societies existed at the earliest of stages and a writing system was developed, and it expresses itself as a confident, secure society at its peak. So, for anybody who's not aware, the Indus Valley Civilization existed from roughly around 3300 BCE to about 1300 BCE. So, BCE meaning before Common Era, the Common Era being considered based on the earlier AD and BC concept, where, the life of Jesus Christ is used to bifurcate history before Christ and after Christ. But it has been changed to before Common Era and after Common Era in modern sensibilities to divest it of religious connotations. So the before Common Era is the period before Christ, but it's called the Common Era. And as we go further back, the years get longer and larger. So um, meaning that 3300 to 1300 BCE, those years of about 2100 years, roughly 2000 years, maybe, those 2000 years are equivalent to the time after BCE, but again, they existed about 5000 years from now. They're 5000 years ago. But you have to get used to that numbering system if you're not already. Okay. So the Indus Valley Civilization existed as a whole generally from 3300 BCE to 1300 BCE. But the mature period, when it's considered at its height, when it's expressed at its greatest form, when the great cities existed and was considered one of the powers of the world, is roughly from around 2600 BCE to 1900 BCE. So, roughly for around 700 years, it was at its peak. This is the period again when ancient Egypt is existing in the Nile Valley and the different Mesopotamian civilization are existing between the rivers Euphrates and Tigris, and the earliest kingdoms of China are alleged to have existed. And the different writing systems and different cultural ideas were born during this period. The thing about the Indus Valley civilization that separates from the other three is that we haven't decoded its writing system. The Indus script and language has not been understood, and we are not able to decipher what the symbols mean. And therefore, the people who lived in the Indus Valley civilization haven't been able to talk to us directly and tell us their stories. We have architecture from the period. We have the Great Bath. We have organized cities, planned cities with uniformly planned streets and houses and not royal, but government architecture. We have cities with drainage systems uh, and uniform mud brick walls and buildings, but we have nothing that tells us anything about the religious or political structure of this civilization. What we do know is that nothing that is similar to what existed in ancient Mesopotamia or ancient Egypt existed in the Indus Valley civilization. And by that, I mean, we don't have any grand mortuary temples. We don't have any temples at all. We don't have any royal palaces. We don't have any monumental architecture on the scale of what we have found in ancient Mesopotamia or ancient Egypt or Kemet in the Indus Valley civilization. It seems to have been not a monarchy. What kind of government or administrative system they had, we don't know. It must have been quite secure and quite functional because most of the sites in the Indus Valley civilization that have been discovered so far, and there have been quite a few that have been discovered, they all follow a similar pattern of uniformity and structure and organization, which means there must have been a great onus for control and unification. But we don't know if it was a kingdom or if it was an empire or if it was a collection of city-states following similar ideas. We just don't know. What we do know is that we don't have any remnants of great palaces. We don't have any remnants of temples. We don't have any religious architecture. We don't have any great images of great gods or anything like that. The greatest material archaeologically that we have discovered from Indus Valley civilization are the magnificent seals depicting animals and persons and symbols associated with it. Some of them have been called like the Pashupati symbol. That is a later accreditation to an early symbol. We don't know if it was actually referring to a Pashupati. It appears to be a seated figure with a bull-like horned headgear on its head, surrounded by animals. We don't know what it symbolizes. We don't know what it means. It may be a headman. It might be a leader. It might be a religious symbol. It might just be a kooky little figure. It might be a talisman. We don't know. But it's only later in the British and then the later Indian nationalists who have associated with later Hindu gods and Vedic gods. But we don't know if there was any association really. Nothing can be proven at this point until the language of the Indus Valley civilization is deciphered. Another thing that we have to note about the Indus Valley civilization is that even though it was one of the largest of the ancient civilizational structures, even though it was the largest of the states that existed during that time, by about 900 BCE, it started to go into decline and it vanished into the sands of time, leaving no trace of its people. And it had vanished until the British, who were occupying India during the 18th and 19th centuries, went into that area and started digging the area for laying down railway tracks to exploit Indian resources that they found the ancient civilization. There are no records of it in any Indian historical documents, and there are no records of it from the period before the British occupation of India. They had become a vanished civilization, a lost civilization, until they were rediscovered in the last 150 years or so. So, how they are connected to later Indian civilizations and different cultures, we don't really know. Studies are being done. Different people have different perspectives on it. Some people think that later Indic ideas and histories and civilizations are connected to the Indus Valley civilization. We have no way to prove it yet because, again, we haven't deciphered their language or their script, so we don't know. Unless we find a Rosetta Stone for the Indus Valley script, we may never know. And conjecture is all we have. But the real history of India that we are interested in, that has gone on for the rest of the 2,500 or so years of Indian history, begins with the movement and establishment of Iron Age, or Vedic, or the painted graveware, or the pre-dynastic stage of Indian history. I use these very different names because depending on what source you go to, they use different names. If you are a historian who wants to be neutral, you use terms like the Iron Age Indians or the painted graveware culture. I use the term pre-dynastic India because this is the period of Indian history where we don't have any kings, we don't have any kingdoms, we don't have any dynasties ruling significant amount of land. If you go to a religious person or a Hindu nationalist, they would call it the Vedic period or the ancient golden India or something like that. The Vedic Indic period roughly starts around 1500 BCE and ends roughly around 500 BCE. So it's a 1,000 year period. This is the period in which the Vedic corpus is collected and spread throughout what is today northern India. And the ideas of an Indian civilization are established in India during this period. So the Iron Age Vedic period from 1500 to 500 BCE can be considered the foundation of all of Indian civilizations. And this is the period in which the people who spoke Indo-Aryan languages which developed and descended from Indo-European languages, moved into what is today Pakistan and northwestern India and settled in, established themselves over several hundred years. It wasn't an invasion, there was never an invasion. It can be considered a migration of peoples over several hundred years when these people moved in to the Indian subcontinent, got acclimatized with its geography, its flora, its fauna, its rivers, its lands, its mountains. It's an entirely different setup from Central Asia, from possibly where they might have come. And then these Indo-Aryan language speakers brought with them iron tools and started using them. They might have coexisted with the later Indus Valley Civilization people, and they would have exchanged ideas and languages and themes and helped each other out and set up individual tribal states. And by states, I mean small villages or tribal units all across northwestern India. And it is during this period that these Indo-Aryan language speakers spread the idea of the Vedas. The Vedas are the oldest texts available in any Indo-Aryan language, and they are closely related to the ancient Greek Homeric texts as well as the Avestan texts in the what is today Iran. So these are closely connected and in their earliest stages. And you can see similar ideas expressed in them, but they all developed individually and separate from each other in their home locations. The Vedas in India, the Avesta in Iran, and the ancient Homerian texts in ancient Greece, particularly the Mycenaean stories and stuff in ancient Greece, and even Old Norse. It went to what is today Norway and developed in that region, and it grew apart from each other. And these sisters grew into establish their own families, so to speak, in their different homelands, and then evolved and set up their cultures. The earliest of these texts is the Rig Veda, and if you look at the Rig Veda, the language used in it is not classical Sanskrit. It is an earlier form of Sanskrit, which is again earlier form of Sanskrit than the language that is used in the Upanishads and even the later Vedic texts. If you look at them, the language used, the way it is expressed, the meter used, everything is slightly different from the later Vedic texts and hugely different from the classical Sanskrit that came into being much later. So when you think about Vedic texts, don't think of them as existing in a uniform linguistic sphere. The Rigvedic language is very different from classical Sanskrit of, say, a Brahmagupta or an Aryabhatta. It is very different from the Upanishads, which were again later texts which expounded on the Vedas. The Vedas were a way for these early Indo-Aryan language speakers to express their ideas, to talk about their gods, to talk about their sacred geographies. And it was all kept inside people's heads in the ritual priests who were the Brahmanas, who were not officially called that at this point. But these priests carried these ideas in their heads. These were geniuses who carried all this information, all these histories, all these shlokas in their heads. And again, this was long before writing came into being. So the history of the Vedic corpus far predates the writing system. It must have existed for a few centuries before it was, properly idealized and expressed in the Indian subcontinent. And it took on ideas and geographies and flora and fauna of the Indian subcontinent into it. The earliest stages of the Rig Veda, for example, are very similar to expressions expressed in the scriptures of the Mitanni people far across the Asian sphere out near Syria. Because in some of the documents from the period from the Mitanni, while they ratified a treaty with the Hittites, they mention what we call Indian gods, like Agni and Varuna and Indra, as representatives of the Mitanni. So clearly there were connections between the societies, but the way they expressed themselves changed over time. So the Vedic culture, based on the four Vedas and that system, got itself established during the 1000 years of the Vedic period, when iron tools came into India and started to be used more predominantly. Horses appeared in the Indian record for the very first time. These tribal people, these were not kingdoms, these were tribal people based on a nomadic culture where cattle rearing and cattle herding was the primary source of nutrition and lifestyles, and everything evolved around it. And the Vedas are full of references to cattle raids between the different tribes who came into these lands. And when you look at the texts, it tells you a lot about the tribal lifestyles of these people. The leaders of these tribes were called Rajan, who were the political figures. These were not great kings. These were not powerful states that existed during this time. And you can see the struggle between the power of the political sphere, which is that of the Rajan, and the religious or cultural sphere, which is of the Brahmanas, existing during this period. And everybody's trying to figure out where they position themselves in society. And the people who spoke this earlier form of Sanskrit and the other Prakrits, we have to mention the other local and regional and low form of languages that were spoken by the average person. It is not that Sanskrit was not spoken by people, but it was most probably reserved for the elites of the society to communicate with each other, and everybody else spoke in different versions of Indo-Aryan languages called Prakrits or Apabhramsas. And these people, again, did not put anything down in writing, and we don't have any architectural evidence from this period. We have a few pieces of pots, broken pots, and stuff like that, but that doesn't give us a great idea about the society itself. They cleared forests and started setting up agriculture. This is the period in which agriculture is established in northern India. And again, the references to forest clearing that appear in the Mahabharata gives us a indication of what was considered important in this period. So by the 900s BCE, the first of these tribal societies start to coalesce into small kingdoms, and the idea of kingship starts to evolve in India during this period. So it's only in the first millennium BCE that we get the first inklings of monarchy in India. And that birth of an idea of a monarchy where all the resources are controlled by one person or one family, and then everybody else has to listen to them and follow them, comes from this period, from this tribal period where everybody did cattle raids, and the beneficiaries of these raids, the prizes that were won, were distributed among the people, and then the leader of the raids got majority of it, and then he elevated himself, and slowly these tribal groups evolved into small, really small kingdoms, and the birth of monarchy happened in India. And this would again evolve into its next stage when the first pre-dynastic period of India, from around 1000 BCE to 500 BCE, in that period, proto-states start to appear, and we get the first references to historical people in this period. And these historical people appear in some of the earliest literatures of India. The Mahabharata and the Ramayana make their first appearance during this period. But do they? That is something that we'll have to discuss in the next episode of Dravidian Dust History. To sum everything up that we have discussed, I have talked about what are the sources for the history of ancient India. We've also talked about the early pre-dynastic period and the Indus Valley Civilization, the period when we had no kings. So this is the period when there are no kings in India. Earlier stage Indus Valley Civilization, we don't know how they governed themselves, but they were a fabulous society. But by the first millennium BCE, the Indus Valley Civilization has gone. the Indo-Aryan language speakers have moved in, started to settle in over a period of few centuries. They have established themselves. They were doing their cattle raids. They were high ritualists. They had the early forms of Sanskrit and other Prakrits to talk amongst each other. That was different from the regional tribal and Adivasi languages. And they separated themselves from the local people, but they also integrated themselves with these people in certain ways. And the language evolved, and Sanskrit itself started to evolve. And then by the first millennium BCE, the first of the proto states start to form in India. The birth of kingship is beginning. We get the first mentions of probable historical figures, and that is the earliest phase of monarchic history in India. We'll catch up with the rest of it in the next episode. Till then, I hope everybody has a wonderful week. This is Arjun. Take care.